What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Speaking Sessions podcast. I've got Sarah Lohse here, and she is an award-winning author, marketer, and brand architect with a knack for turning narratives into connections. Through Favorite Daughter Media, she has helped businesses and entrepreneurs develop their brand stories and connect with their audiences using strategic media and podcast. Her book, Open This Book, The Art of Storytelling for Aspiring Thought Leaders, is now available on Amazon. And today we're not going to get into the book per se, but I'm sure what we're going to talk about is going to be all about the book. But we're going to talk about storytelling techniques and some other great things that will really be helpful for you on your next stage. But without further ado, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here as well, because storytelling is one of those things that we always can improve and get better at, and it is a crucial part of that. Me being a former engineer and everything, I'm around a lot of people that are data-driven. That's all they want to talk about is the facts and figures, and they don't want to get into the stories, but they can't understand why leadership doesn't understand what's going on when they're just trying to give them all the details. And non-engineers don't want details. They want the high level overview, which comes through a story. So kind of talk to us about how you started getting into storytelling and how that's evolved for you over time.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting / embarrassing story because I actually got into storytelling when I was brought on one of the biggest finance podcasts to talk about a really embarrassing tattoo.
Wow.
And yeah, was not planned. I had pitched, I was producing a finance podcast, and I had pitched the host to be on, it was Stacking Benjamin, so really amazing finance show. I was pitching him to be a guest and did not know how to pitch at the time, even though now that's part of what I do for a living. And he's an expert in this, and he does this, and he has these letters after his name. And the host looks at me and says, "Yeah, that's great. I don't need an expert. I want someone with a cool story." And I think I may have had a stroke or something, because the next thing I said was, "Do you want to hear about the time I got a tattoo of a penis while I was in Ireland?" And he did. So I accidentally got myself booked. But it was a really amazing experience because he had to, as the host, find the value in that story for his audience, other than just, "This is hilarious, I need this on my show." So he walked me through telling it through the interview in a way that taught me how to tell it better. And I just live on air learned how to tell a good story. And since then, I've just really just dived into it. And I've studied the neuroscience behind storytelling and all these different ways that we can use it professionally. And I've kind of gotten a little obsessed.
Yeah. I'm not.
Was that the answer you were expecting?
No, definitely not at all. And I definitely did not expect to be talking about penises. This is definitely a first on the podcast. So
you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah,
I appreciate
I got rid of your clean writing. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Well, good thing I at least put explicit for that, just in case somebody says a cuss word normally. Not talking about male genitalia or anything like that. But no,
I am one of a kind.
There we go. And speaking of that, that's what stories do for you. They make you memorable. And in this case, hopefully they'll remember something else as well from this podcast episode, but they're going to at least remember the penis story from Sarah. So tell us more about why storytelling is so important. I think I gave a little teaser there with that, but tell us in your ideas and how you've helped other people, why storytelling is so crucial for us as speakers, as podcasters, as just individuals when we're trying to communicate with other people.
Yeah, stories are just vital. We are in a 24/7 news cycle. We are getting hit with so much content every day. I don't remember if it was 60 million or 60 billion pieces of content are put out into the world every single day. And that's a lot. It's a big number.
Yeah.
And how do you stand out from that? How do you get people to remember who you are? And when you're just putting out information that's not memorable, it doesn't matter how interested someone is in a topic. If you just throw a stat at them, it's not going to mean anything. And
wait, so you're telling me I can't say the same quote that everybody else has quoted from, like Jim Rohn or Tony Robbins or this famous person, Socrates, something like that, that's not going to get me in front of everybody.
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. Yes, no one has said it before.
Yeah.
It's so true. We are always seeing these same messages, and especially in like marketing messages, people are savvy now. They know when they're being sold to. They know when something is a marketing message and they don't want it. I was actually listening to your show, and one of your guests, I think her name was Caitlin. She was the social media doctor, something like that. Yeah, she was talking about this too, and how we don't want to interact with brands. We want to interact with people.
Yeah.
And you have to turn yourself into a person. And if you get on a stage, on a podcast, whatever it is, and you just start talking about your business or you start talking about this information, it sounds like an infomercial. And that's not fun. People want to interact with you as a person. They want to know who you are. They want to build that trust, build that relationship. And stories do that. Stories have this just innate power to drive those connections. Our brains, like I mentioned, the neuroscience behind it, our brains are wired for stories. So just scientifically, we want to hear them, and they're what's going to stick way more than information.
And so how do we pick out the right stories? Because I've lived a long time. I'm a whopping 33 years old. And so I've got a lot of life behind me that I have a lot of stories to go with. And of course, some may match, some may not. But how do I pick one of those stories? Because I hear this, and I'm saying this as somebody in the audience, I hear this, and I think, well, that's a lot of, if I'm going to talk about me and my life, that's a lot of life that I've lived. So how do I pick out the right story for the right situation?
No, I'm in the same boat. At 28, I wrote my first memoir.
Gosh, oh, wow. I mean, I'm not wasn't going to say anything or ask your age, but wow. Old.
I just turned 29 last month, so my back is feeling it. But it's picking a story. It's almost hard to explain, but not, because I'm somebody that it's just natural. Anytime I hear someone say something, my brain reacts in stories, and I'm like, oh my God, I have to tell you this. Someone is telling me something, and my brain is just waiting, like, okay, is it my turn yet? I have to tell this. It's probably my ADHD, but when it comes to choosing stories, it really just comes down to, what is the message that you're trying to get across? What do you want people to understand? And the easiest way to choose those stories is just to think back to how you learned it. What was happening in that moment? What was that really pivotal time in your life that you had to choose which path to go down, and that made all the difference? Robert Frost. What are all of these things that were happening in your life that really came down to, this is going to change everything from here? And those circumstances around it, what was happening, that is your story. So it's just, what did you learn? How did you learn it? And why does someone else want to learn it too?
What did you learn? How did you learn it? And why would it be beneficial for somebody else? Essentially. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And that's a great little map right there, because, okay, tell a story, but where does that story go from there? And I've seen that with speakers, and I'm probably guilty of that myself, where I'll tell a story, especially when I'm trying to tell a joke, and then it's got no punchline to it. There's no real meaning behind it. It's like, all right, so what was the purpose of that? That's what I think when other people tell it. And I'm sure people have said the same thing about me, like, okay, Philip, well, what do you mean there? So yeah, having that. So what does this mean for you, the audience? Yeah, that's a great thing for sure to be doing. That way we're educating, but then also kind of telling them. A lot of times whenever I talk about, when you're speaking about something, I talk about giving that next step, especially when you're trying to present to leaders on something for them to make a decision. It's not about, here's the information, what do you want to do? No, it's like, okay, here's the information, and here's what I think we should do next. What do y'all think now? Like, here's the decision. Like, can we make a decision based on this? Or, hey, here's what we're going to do next. That way, now, oh, okay, you are going to do something else. It's not like you're just stopped here and you haven't thought about anything. So kind of giving that next step to them.
It's presenting a solution instead of presenting a problem. Yeah. But the stories that you tell back up that solution. You tell the stories that prove that either I've done this before and it worked out well, or I've seen this happen and this is what happened from it. So even, I know you guys talked about it on the same episode. It's something that I call like forced vulnerability, when I think you guys talked about it more as like playing the victim. but always having like a sob story and really just leaning into that sob story. And I see that all the time with speakers where they want to get your attention and make that connection. So they just latch on to the worst thing that's ever happened to them. But then at the end, when they try to tie it to a message, it does not fit because it was obviously just, I really want to tell the story. Let me Frankenstein the point together. And it doesn't work. So with storytelling, you don't have to go that deep. And some people aren't comfortable going that deep, and some people don't have to. And people don't realize when you say telling a story, it doesn't have to be a childhood trauma story. It doesn't have to be something sensational. It can just be a case study. And it doesn't even have to be a case study that you did. It can be one that you read about. Stories come in so many different sizes and shapes and everything that there's always going to be one that's relevant. And it doesn't have to be something that you're digging really deep and making yourself uncomfortable and making everyone else uncomfortable. It can just be, I did this last year with a client and here's what happened.
Yeah. So you can go as deep as you want. And of course, depending on the situation, maybe you're not going to go that deep into the story, giving all the details, and it's hard to say this is how much into detail you should go, but essentially go enough into detail to make it relatable with the audience, show that you have that proven track record, and then be able to tie it in with that whatever message, whatever information you're trying to give the audience, right?
Yeah, I usually say give all of the details that make it make sense and make it so that the listeners can almost put themselves into it, but get rid of everything else. And it's like when you listen to your mom tell a story, unless this is just me, but I don't think it is. I think it's just a mom thing where they give every detail possible, including the backstories of every person that shows up in the story. You don't need that. A story should not take that long, and it does not need all that detail. All you need to know is what happened and how. So making sure that you're choosing only the important details that if you didn't include them, it wouldn't make sense. You just go from there.
Yeah. I can't help but think about my mom with that sometimes, especially it's like stories about me she wants to say when I'm around and she's trying to tell my wife about it. She give all these details. I'm like, those are irrelevant. But then kids also do that same thing. They just start talking and talking and talking. You're like, yeah, as adults, you're like, okay, I'm not going to be rude, but when are you going to stop? Like your eyes start getting big. You're like, okay, I'm ready to move on. But then they're just, oh yeah, and this, that, and the other. So it's funny.
Kids can be either the best or worst storytellers in the world. It's so true.
Yeah. I had my nephew one time. I have my studio's and I've got a shed, and this is like my little room where I do my podcast. And he was wanting to go out there. He was like, oh, let's do a podcast. So I'm like, hey, we'll put it like as unlisted on YouTube so he can be on YouTube and everything. And it was like talking about, the neighbors and this, that, and the other, like, and just kept going on. I'm like, all right, cool, man. But he was just going on and on. It was so funny. And then we just watched it the other day. And he was like embarrassed, just laughing about it and everything. Yeah. But it's just, a good time. And then him being a kid too, there at the end is like, he had stayed the night with us, and his last name is Bab, and mine Sessions. And he was just like, I was like, oh yeah, so you're Sessions now, right? You're so annoying. I'm not a Bab. I'm not a Sessions. I'm a Bab. And he's like, and I hope this goes on YouTube. It was just so funny. So of course I left it in there and put it on YouTube for the family to be able to see and stuff. But kids can be so funny. But then again, I think it comes down to the moment, because I know some of my funniest moments have been like that thing that's just in my head, and I decide to say it rather than like I've really planned it out or I was really craftful with it, and this will be just so funny. And usually when I do that, it's not funny at all, and it's probably a dad joke or something that I've made up.
Okay, I am a big fan of the dad joke, and all of my jokes tend to be dad jokes, so
nice.
No judgment there. But I've had people like I'll speak at an event, and they come up to me like, "Oh my god, have you thought about stand-up comedy?" And I'm like, none of that was on purpose. Yeah, that was just me messing things up, and thank you for thinking it was funny. So
yeah, and that goes to the power of just like going with it. Just who cares what happens. Everybody's going to make mistakes. Let's just keep moving forward. As you as a speaker, you're going to make that mistake. And too many of us are so worried about what other people are going to think about us. And like you said, they didn't even know at the end of the day. And that wasn't in your script. That wasn't prepared, but you just went ahead and moved forward. and now it became funny and people remembered that about you.
I spoke at a conference and they had a mirror behind me and I forgot it was there and like walked into it. And I just turned and said, wow, I should have seen that coming. And people thought that was the funniest thing. I'm like, I meant to say that in my inside voice, and that came out in my outside voice. I did not mean to say this. But like you were saying, like people are afraid of getting up and talking in front of people because they're afraid of like what they'll think. A lot of it is they're afraid that they're going to mess up and they're going to say the wrong thing, which is why I really hone in on you need to tell stories, because how do you mess them up?
Yeah.
If you're telling your story, you're speaking from experience. You're speaking from this is what happened. You lived it. It's easier to tell it. It's not, oh, I memorized a whole list of statistics. I have all of these facts. Like you can say a statistic wrong. You can get the facts wrong, but you can't really mess up your story. And even if you did, nobody's going to know because they weren't there. So it's so much easier to feel prepared and feel ready and just get on with it if you're just telling stories.
Yeah. And like Anchorman says, it's like 70% of the time I'm right all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So, those statistics. Yeah, and I agree with you. And that's why when I talk about speaking and getting ready for your next presentation or speaking on a stage, just really having an outline and then having the ideas of what you want to share, but then fill it in with stories. It needs to be all stories. And if you want to have some fact or figure, sure, have that ready. But the story is going to be the thing that's really going to get people engaged and remember you and remember the information as well. And then, like you said, for us also as speakers, a lot easier to remember a story that we've been through, we've lived out, than remembering all the facts of what happened. Oh, yeah, I was at this point in the business and then this point and all these things, and I had this many employees, whatever. It's going to be hard to remember that, but you can remember the feelings of how you felt. You can remember going through it. What are some of the things that you did? But it's all the story, something that you've lived out for sure. So how do we connect with a diverse audience? So it's easy, maybe not, when you're just thinking about the one person and you're not actually speaking in front of a group. But when we're actually speaking in front of a group and we don't necessarily know everybody, how do we make sure that our story is able to connect with that diverse audience?
That's a really good question. And I think it kind of just comes down to choosing small stories. And this is something that people get wrong a lot because I talk to a lot of people about public speaking and about how to choose a story. And if I tell them, okay, what are your stories? What story do you want to tell? They tell me I don't have a story. And that always confuses me because how don't you have a story? You've never lived through anything. But what they're really saying is I don't have a story that's important enough. I don't have a story that is worth sharing. And it's because of that 24/7 news cycle that we live in. We're always bombarded with headlines. We're bombarded with these massive stories that are globally life-changing, that are sensational, traumatic, or dramatic, that someone went out and changed the world. And those are great stories. But I've never changed the world.
Yeah.
And I probably won't ever. I'm never going to be Malala. I'm never going to be like Martin Luther King Jr. So those stories can inspire us, but they're not going to really connect with us on a personal level because we can't relate to them. We've never done these amazing things. But we've all done the little things. We've all been in those positions of we're just trying our best. So when I talk about choosing your stories, choose the little stories. Choose the ones that are those everyday moments where you just learned a lesson that's going to stick with you. And it doesn't have to be one that changed the world. And I tell my stupid story about a tattoo because a lot of people have had embarrassing tattoos. A lot of people have vacation stories that just really stay with them. If I go into the backstory of that, it includes being really stressed in my career, being in a really bad relationship and getting my heart broken, all of these different experiences that everybody in the world has had. So when you tell those stories that are just the everyday stories, no matter who you're talking about, people are going to find something in it that they can relate to. And I think that the best storytellers in the world, other than some kids, are stand-up comedians. And when you think about it, they, especially when they're just beginning and they don't have their like cult following yet, they have to tell a story that's going to connect with an entire room and make them laugh. And they have to do it for like 30 minutes. How many stories can I tell that are going to connect with every single person in the room? But they do it because they are purposely really vague and really just unremarkable. There's so many of those classic jokes are, what about airline food? And oh my god, this traffic happened. Like these really simple topics, like everyone has related to those, but they're able to tell it in a way that makes it funny and keeps it being relatable. I think it was Ira Glass who said good stories happen to those who can tell them. So if you take those small relatable moments and you just tell it well, it's gonna relate to everyone in the room.
Wow, so true there, and a couple of things resonated with me. First of all, that you mentioned that, yeah, we think about like the rags to riches, like, oh, I don't have that rags to riches story. That's one way I can relate with this, is that I don't have that, and that was me for a while. Where what value can I bring? What story do I have? Because I wasn't some meth head that turned my life around and now have a bajillion-dollar business, or I didn't go to jail and then come out and start this multi-billion-dollar business. Like
maybe you should consider that.
Yeah.
Have you thought about starting meth?
Yeah. Is I don't think the penis tattoo is going to work for me.
That's a one and done. Like no one else is going to be able to turn that story into something that's that big. Exactly. So you're just gonna have to take one for the team and do meth.
Yeah, I have this birthmark. I've had somebody say like it looks like a backwards Africa, and then somebody wrote a mullet one time. So maybe like I can just put like a face of Chris Rock or something, and then I can have like the Chris Rock birthmark mullet kind of thing going on, and
that's your new identity. Yes.
Exactly. but oh man, but yeah, we don't need those like crazy, drastic, Hollywood-esque movie type stories for us to be able to relate with people. Like you said, it's those little things. And I know for me being a dad, a girl dad and everything, sometimes I'll post something about that and I have more comments on that than any educational thing that I'll ever do on social media. Actually, my most viral video that I have on YouTube was like a sound of, I don't even know her name, Peter's wife from Family Guy, where she's like getting mad at him, and it's just the audio, but then it's like me I have the dog, and I only had one daughter at the time, and I'm like pushing her, and it's like she's getting pissed off, and it's the point of view when your wife tells you to get out of the house with the kids, and it had like over 10,000 views on it. It was like a lot of people related with it and everything, but it was just something small, just like you were saying with the airline stuff. It's all about those small little things that are relatable. And I'm glad that you mentioned that it doesn't need to be super specific. There definitely are times where I believe we should focus in on an avatar, but not be so narrowed in that it's, let's say a dad with two girls under 3 years old, and the dad's between 30 to 35, and he lives in the southern United States, and this and on and so forth. Like, we don't need to get that granular when it comes to Avatar, but somebody's experienced flying before and the terrible food, or maybe in the lack of food now compared to 10 or 15 years ago and stuff like that. So just having something like that and little stories like that, yeah, definitely beneficial. So
and it depends on where you're, like what you're doing and what the situation is, because sometimes you're in a very general room, and sometimes you're in a room of everyone is the same profession or everyone has the same interest. So when you go in those more specific rooms, you're able to tailor your stories to fit. And in those situations, you're telling stories that make things make sense in that person's context. How does this relate to what they're going through? But when you're in those specific rooms, the stories that you tell are meant to put that information into their context. How do you take something that you've done in your industry and make it relevant to theirs? And that's when you get that little bit more specific. But when you have that general audience, pick the things that are more general and have those general messages The stories can still be specific. My story is very specific. It's about this tattoo and what happened. But the messages are what are kind of universal.
And so how does that, is in the room, that makes a lot of sense. You got a general audience, you're going to have a very diverse audience. Then you can also have very specific, but when it comes to a podcast, let's say you're going on to somebody's podcast, how do you figure out what stories to share?
Well, podcasts are very specific for the most part. I mean, I launch podcasts for people, and I specialize in creating a new podcast concept. And for the most part, we try to get as specific as possible with our audience. So it can be really easy, but some people think they can go into a podcast guesting opportunity and not do any prep work. So you really have to do some research and figure out who the audience is. Because if I came on here and I've related all of my stories to golf, because it's like, there's probably someone that listens to golf, that listens to the show. That's, yeah, maybe someone, but everyone that listens to the show wants to be a public speaker, wants to be a better speaker. So my stories have something to do with public speaking. So you want to just know your audience as much as you can. And podcasts really do give you that opportunity to talk to a very niche audience.
Good to know there. And how else would you do that besides maybe the research? Like how have you kind of gone about knowing who the audience is? I guess both for actual events where you're speaking in person, but then also going on podcasts. How do you go about doing that research? I guess maybe a better question.
Yeah, it's sometimes like if I'm speaking at an event and I don't know the audience, just ask whoever you went through to get get the speaking gig, get that opportunity. Talk to them, ask them who their audience is, what is helpful. And like when you and I got on before, I asked, is there anything specific that I can give to give the most value? Because I'm asking, what does your audience want? What are they looking for? And a lot of people rely on guesswork. Even with their own clients or the people that they work with, they think this is what my audience wants, but they don't ask. They don't take that minute to say like, hey, like, what are you guys interested in? You guys have followed me. What made you follow me? What is it you guys are wanting to get out of me? And a lot of times it's not going to be the same thing that we think it is. So as many opportunities as you have to ask questions, whether it's to your actual audience or to the people that gather that audience together, ask as many questions as you can.
Asking questions. Who would have guessed that'd be the best thing to do? Yeah.
I'm a pretty innovative thinker.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a lot of these really unique ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's super complex there. But
you can pay me for my method. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay, I'll definitely pay you that. Was it $9.97? I'm guessing influencer.
Yes, and I will tell you to put a question mark at the end of your sentence.
Oh, nice. I like that. Good punctuation. So there's grammar involved in that too.
There is. That's what makes it tricky. Yeah, you got to use a question mark instead of a period.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty true. It is pretty tricky for a lot of people on grammar. It seems like anymore these days.
True. That's true.
But you said about asking questions. So besides asking the audience, I'm kind of curious there. How do you go about doing that without like putting a post out there directly? Because I could see where that could come off as a little unprofessional, given that you're just like, hey, what do y'all want to hear? I don't know what to speak about. So what do y'all want to hear? Obviously, you're not going to do it that way. But how do we do it in a way that is engaging and makes the audience feel like, hey, we want to help them and be there for them and make sure we're sharing content specific for them that they want?
Yeah, there's a few different ways to do it, and it depends on kind of the context. I've done it where I've sent out email blasts when I get a big jump on my email list, of whether I'm part of a giveaway or something, and the people are just really jump in my email list in in the dozens. I'll send out an email blast of like, hey, thanks so much for joining my mailing list. What kind of content or information are you interested in? And I'll have a couple different buttons of just, I want to learn about personal branding. I want to learn about podcasting, storytelling. And that just gives me an idea of what they're looking for and lets me segment my audience so I can send specific content to specific audiences so I know I'm giving them what they want. But when you're in a public speaking part, you always can start a presentation with questions. And you see this happen all the time. It's, so how many people in here do this? How many people in here have done this or like this? You start with those questions. And if you have a couple go-to stories that are always just in your back pocket, and they're stories that can be really malleable and they can be kind of moved around to fit any situation, you just know based on the answers to that quick little by a raise of hands, you can tailor those on the fly. And I always recommend just having, if some people are those natural storytellers where they just think in stories, and some people aren't, and that's okay. But if you have like a little story bank where you know, here are my 5 stories that are kind of universal and I can make them fit anything, just have those in your back pocket. You will never really be that unprepared. Whatever your audience answers, you'll be able to work with it.
And what method would you suggest for us to be able to start to come up with those stories so that we kind of have them prepared? Because there's definitely a lot more people that can't just naturally have a story ready than those that naturally can. So what would you suggest for us to be able to seem as if we're more of a natural storyteller and be prepared?
Sure. So there's so many different types of stories that we can tell. I go into, I think, maybe 10 or 12 of them in my book. But there's 2 methods that I use for figuring out which stories we want to tell. And I call them like the prospective and the retrospective methods. So it's basically looking forward or looking back. So if you know you want to tell one specific story, you have to kind of look forward to what can I use this story to prove? Or what message can I get out of this story? How can I take this story and turn it into something valuable? And then there's the other way, this is my message. I need people to understand this. And this is the more common one. My tattoo story is kind of the opposite because we knew I had to tell the story about this tattoo. How do we make it meaningful? But for the most part, this is what I'm trying to get across. So you're just thinking back to how you learned it and all of that. So coming up with a few different stories based on what it is you talk about. And that's why I always recommend people go as specific as they can. Don't be one of those people that like, oh, I talk on this topic, this topic, this topic, this topic, and this topic. Like when you go that general, you're not really proving you're an expert in anything. You're kind of just proving you can study because it kind of just seems like you've memorized a lot of different topics. But when you go that specific, you're only going to have a few key points that you have to prove. So it's a lot easier to choose a couple of those stories and just think of those key messages and think back to how you learned them and write them down. And when you practice like writing them out and telling them over and over again, they're going to be so like second nature. So even if you're not a natural storyteller, you'll feel like you are when it comes to those specific stories.
I like that you mentioned the both directions, and yeah, you're right. The kind of the begin with the end in mind. What is that message you want to give, and then fill that in with stories so that you can make your way to that end point of here's what I shared essentially. Versus the other way, yeah. Let me start with I just love this story. This is a great story. For whatever reason, you want to just share that story, and then how do I make that relate? Yeah, that's way harder to do that.
It's a lot harder. It's a lot less common.
Yeah. And I know I've definitely done that before. I was just like stuck in my head. Like I've got to tell this story. I've got to tell this joke in some way, shape or form. So I'm going to figure out a way to do that. And yeah, it took a lot more effort to make it work versus just, hey, what do I actually want to talk about? And going back and figure out what things can actually fit into that message and what stories can I share and everything.
Yeah. The other way is kind of like the stand-up comedian way, because it's like something happens, they're like, okay, how do I make this funny?
Yeah.
So that's something that they'll use that method. They'll have that story, and then how do I make it relate? How do I make it memorable? But for the most part, this is what I want to say. How am I going to say it?
Yeah. And you mentioned that a lot of speakers just like to keep things general, and I feel like we're all guilty of that because I can speak about anything. I can do business on anything. I just want to help people. I just want to do this. I just want to make money or whatever that thing is. And you start out so generic. And I'm sure that's what happens for you when you're talking with your clients about a podcast. Like, I just want to talk about life, talk about business, family, the 4 F's, family, fitness, finances, and fun, whatever. Like, let's just talk about those. And that's fine and dandy. but it's not specific, so people aren't going to necessarily come to you or want you on their stage or on their podcast because, yeah, you're a generalist in a sense. So, how do you help coach your clients through that and help them understand that being more of a specialist is more beneficial in the end than being a generalist?
I think it comes down to we all can speak about anything. And I can get up and talk about my dogs for an hour. I can get up and talk about gymnastics because I did that when I was a kid and I remember some stuff. We could talk about anything, but it's are you going to talk about that you get so excited about? What are the things that you're the most passionate about? I used to have almost like a tagline for my company that was use your outside voice. And I would say that because when we were kids, we all had that feeling of we are just so excited, we're bubbling over, we have to yell. We get so excited about something, we have to scream about it. And we're always getting told to use your inside voice. And sometimes we're outside when we're told that, but parents just don't want you to be loud. And but you have to remember that feeling from when you're a kid of like, I am just so excited, I'm bubbling over, I need to just yell about this. And you just have to use your outside voice when you talk about it. That's what you need to continue to talk about. Because if you're not passionate about something, people are going to know. If you're just talking about something because you just want to get the views, you want to get the clicks, people are going to know. They can hear BS. They can hear when you're just going through the motions and just putting stuff out there to put it out there. So when you find that thing that it's just you will talk about it forever. If someone brings up the topic while you're at dinner, your partner turns to you and says, "Do not get started on this. Don't get them started. They'll never shut up." Those are the topics you need to stop shutting up about and really lean into those. And I talk about being an expert as not necessarily someone that knows everything, but it's someone that's endlessly curious. So, what are the topics that you are endlessly curious about? What are the ones that you wake up and you immediately jump on YouTube and try to find more information about, or you jump on the internet and are searching ways that you can study this more? What are the things that you're just always wanting to think about and find new ways and find new perspectives? Those are the things you need to be talking about because your passion for it and your excitement for it is going to get the people listening to be passionate about it and to be excited about it because those emotions are tangible and they're transferable.
Man, so true, so good. And I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation talking about storytelling, talking about speaking in general, which is the thing that I'm passionate about and I love. And it's funny you mentioned that because sometimes my wife is like, yeah, he won't stop talking. And my older girl right now, she talks all the time. She's like, yeah, she's just like her dad. She never stops talking, never stops singing all this stuff. And it's awesome. I love it. I love that she's doing that. And I can't help but think about like sometimes she'll start screaming at the top of her lungs in a restaurant. We're like, all right, you got to calm down. But I have actually thought about that too. We're like, hey, I don't want to tell her, no, don't do that all the time because I don't want her to end up being where she feels like she shouldn't do that and it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
In the restaurant, yeah, not such a good thing. Outside, okay, cool. Like, let's do that and everything.
I think we need to act more like children when it comes to things like this. Like, there's a chapter in my book that I talk about expertise and curiosity, and I tell you to take your topic and act like you're that kid with a magnifying glass, just running through your backyard and finding all of these new little worlds and turning over stones and trying to dig in the dirt to find more and more. That's the kind of excitement and curiosity you need to have. You need to have that childhood excitement. And that gets kind of beaten out of us as we grow up and we're taught to be more reserved and be more just adults. And being adults it's not fun. Like being a kid and having that curiosity, that's so much fun. And so when you're willing to be wrong about something, you're willing to find more questions than you find answers, things like that, that's when you become that expert because you're just constantly finding more and more information.
So true. And you mentioned the book a few times, so I want you to be able to give a little plug here. What's this book about? I know we mentioned it's on Amazon, but go ahead and tell us a little bit about what your book is about.
Sure. My book is called Open This Book. It's the art of storytelling for aspiring thought leaders. And It just outlines all of the ways that you can make yourself a better storyteller. So it's all the different types of stories that we tell. It's the different ways that we come up with those stories and how we tell them and structure them in a way that they are compelling. But I tell it, like I said, I wrote my first memoir at 28 because it is written through my own stories and taught through stories. So it almost reads like it is a memoir.
There we go. And life coach is next thing on your list. I mean, by the time you hit 30, you for sure can do it. I mean, you missed out on at 20 doing it. So maybe at 30, you'll be able to be a life coach.
I'm waiting for my Nobel Peace Prize to come in. It'll be here soon.
There you go. Just don't do anything and it will happen.
Exactly.
Oh, man. Well, Sarah, this has been a pleasure having you on the show talking. I know we've both been laughing back and forth, being a little sarcastic, but storytelling is something we all need to get better at. So if people want to follow you to be able to learn more about storytelling, where can they follow you at to learn about that?
Yeah, well, if they want, I do have a free downloadable journal with all the different storytelling prompts that I offer in my book. And you can download it for free at openthisjournal.com. And while you're there, you'll see all the links to my social medias. All my contact info is all there. But I'm on all the socials as Favorite Daughter Media.
Awesome. Well, go make sure to go there, open this journal. Open This Book is the name of Sarah's book, but open this journal to get that free downloadable for your storytelling prompts. But Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me.